Hi, everyone, and welcome to TheraWin.Health, your one stop shop for exploring the beauty of culture and therapy. So, today we have with us Dr. Manasi Shankar. Hi, Dr. Shankar, how are you doing today?
Good, Sakshi. How are you doing?
I'm amazing. Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. We're really excited to talk to you.
Of course. Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be here.
Right. So, Dr. Shankar, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your journey in the field of mental health?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm from India. I was born in Kerala, but we moved to Bangalore I believe, when I was 2 years old. So I'm Bangalorean through and through with sprinkles of Malayali, is what I like to say. Very early on, Sakshi, there was this question that was asked to so many of us of what you want to do when you grow up, right? And there was so many engineers and doctors and lawyers around me, but I was so unskilled in those professions. But I always knew that I wanted to do something that would be of service. That was something that was very crucial to who I am as a person. And so I started looking into psychology. And at the time, India was still growing our relationship with that field. Now we are, super forward. We have some of the best training, I would argue, in the world. But back then, not as much. We still had NIMANS and Christ College. But I looked into the US and I did my master's in clinical mental health counseling in Syracuse University, New York, which was wonderful. And I loved it so much. I loved Syracuse. But there was something about the program that was not speaking to me. It was very individual focused. And I'm a very relational thinker, so I think in systems. And so I went ahead and I applied for the PhD in Virginia Tech in couple and family therapy. And that's how I came into the world of MFT, marital and family therapy. And yeah, the rest, as they say, is history. And now I run my own private practice in the Bay Area, California. I specialize in working with South Asian clients, which has been lovely. It's been this sense of giving back to the community, from a mental health perspective, which has been lovely. And I also work with disability as well. So I have the private practice. I also teach at University of San Francisco's graduate counseling psychology program. And then my third role is in research. So my research is really focused on bridging the gap between the field of disability and mental health spaces.
Right. I think they kind of mold together in providing the
Yeah.
service, as you said.
Yeah.
So, what motivated you to focus on psychological and mental health needs of disabled community? Since in India and also throughout the world, we do not talk much about when it comes to mental health of minority people, right? So,
Hmm.
what
Yeah.
motivated you to focus on that?
I love this question. um, Professionally speaking, personally too, but professionally, my biggest inspiration came from two spaces, right? Two, three spaces. One is my father, which I think you and I have talked about briefly, Sakshi, but my father's a disabled person. And growing up, I was a part of that system, right? I was a part of that family system. And so I saw how much medical intervention was necessary, but I also saw how much therapy was necessary, right? We as a family, we were navigating this chronic condition. There was so much pain, there was so much chaos that my father had to navigate, still does. And the mental health component was completely overlooked, but we were over medicalizing his condition and completely overlooking the other systems that were at play, right? And something about that wasn't sitting right with me, because though we have to focus on physical health, we can't overlook mental health when it comes to experiences like disability, right? So my father, I would say, was my biggest inspiration. My second inspiration was the gap in the field of couple and family therapy here in the US. Right? In couple and family therapy, it's really cool because we talk about race and sexuality and gender and all of these cool constructs, but we've completely, again, overlooked disability. And I remember
Yeah.
learning and having conversations about identity and intersectionality. And I was like, wait, why are we not talking about disability at all? Right? We had one reading. I'm not even kidding, Sakshi. We had one reading in graduate school. And that to me was, I would argue, an even bigger inspiration, right? Because it felt wrong. It felt like we as a field are talking so much about things like social justice and intersectionality and identity. And why are we very conveniently leaving behind the largest minority group in the world. And we as mental
Hmm.
health professionals have, from my perspective, had washed our hands out of that conversation.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest for me inspiration and saying, no, we got to change this. We have to have a seat at that table because we have so much to offer to that conversation.
It's truly sad that you mentioned when we talk about mental health, even though we are referring and thinking about everybody together, that not even single community should be missing, and we're missing such great, as you said, it's the largest minority group worldwide.
It's
Right. So,
shocking.
like,
It really is.
yeah. So, Dr. Shankar, I really want to know why is the reason that we miss this part? Since you already have experience, right? Growing up with your father, you have seen how much over medicalization happens in that community. So, why, as mental health professionals or communities, we're overlooking this section?
Hmm. That's such a good question, Sakshi, because it's a question that nobody thinks about often, right? It's a
Right.
question that, again, because there's a sense of washing our hands off that conversation, we haven't really thought about, right? But it's important to answer. And I have this theory. Again, it's not, it's a little bit anecdotal, it's a little bit focused on empirical stuff. When you think about something like architecture, let's
Right.
say this house has, architectural issues around me, that's a very easy problem to solve. You call an architecture, you call an interior designer, there's a very concrete set of people that are able to come in and fix that issue. We don't have to worry about, therapists in that conversation. We don't have to worry about medical professionals. We don't. It's a very easy and simplified problem. But when you think about disability, what field does that conversation belong to? Who's
Mm.
responsible? Right? It's so complex. Is it engineering? Because it is sometimes, right? Is it therapy?
Mm.
It is. It can be architecture, it can be environmental science, it can be politics, it can be economics, it can be medicine, it can be nursing, it can be family therapy, it can be so many things. And
Right.
so, historically, because it's been medical, we as a profession, this is my theory, right? So, we as a profession, as mental health providers, we saw that and we said, oh, okay, so the medical field has got it covered. This is not us. Like, we don't have a seat at that table. This is not ours to look at. And so doctors took over. And I'm not underplaying the role of medical providers, but this is one theory of mine of why we haven't been talking about disability as much, is because we think wrongly. We have this misconception that we don't have much to say or we don't have much to help, while that is actually the opposite, right? Because medical impairment has its place, but disabled people struggle a lot of times with bigger issues like social issues, relational issues, psychological issues, mental health issues that are completely, like we said, squashed because we're over medicalizing.
Right.
So I think this is one of the biggest reasons, right? We just don't think it belongs to us. And fortunately, that's changing, right? And that's why I'm
Mm-hmm.
so grateful for conversations like this because it opens that door.
Definitely, yeah. I think these conversations are necessary. And as you mentioned, I read somewhere when I was doing this research for the podcast is that the real stressor that people with disability usually suffer from is not due to the impairment. It's actually the societal view, the treatment that they get, and the kind of comments that they get from the society. That is the real stressor. Right.
Absolutely. Yes, 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 yes to all of that, right? Because there's this image that I show in my class, and maybe I'll send it to you later. But there's an image that I show in the classes that I teach between the difference between the medical model and the social model, which maybe we'll talk about. But you're describing the social model of disability. The social model of
Yeah.
disability basically essentially says that it's society that disables people, right? The impairment is not the problem.
Mm.
So this image is of this person standing by stairs, right? And there's a signage there that says, everybody welcome. And this person is using a wheelchair and they look up at the stairs and, actually everybody is not welcome, right? And so the medical model says that the impairment is the problem, which is why this person cannot get up the stairs. But the social model says they should have had a ramp. And
Yeah.
so, this idea of environments and architectures and attitudes disabling people, versus the impairment being the problem. I'm so glad you brought this up, Sakshi, because I was working with one of my clients. This was about 2 months ago in therapy, and I asked her, let's say you had options for two therapists, right? Therapist A has a ramp, has an elevator, is infrastructurally super accessible, great. But the attitude is horrible. Let's say the attitude is filled with like oppressive tendencies, marginalization, prejudice, stigma, all of that, right? And therapist
Yeah.
B does not have a ramp, only has stairs, but they're willing to learn. They're saying, I don't know yet, but I'm curious. And they have the attitude of
Mm.
inclusivity, they have the attitude of equality and providing equitable resources. And I asked this client, this
Okay.
disabled client, I said, which therapist would you go to? And it was such a
Mm.
quick answer, right? And she said, of course, therapist B. Because things like a ramp, things like an elevator can be fixed very easily, right? But attitudinal accessibility is harder to achieve. So I hope that answers your question. But yes, it's us. We as environments and we as structures and systems are really the biggest source of disabling people, not the impairment itself, usually.
It totally makes sense. Dr. Shankar, you mentioned that the reason why it happens is that we tend to over medicalize disabled population, which affects their overall mental health. So can you elaborate on that?
So if I was to ask you to close your eyes, right, or the listeners of our podcast to just close their eyes and imagine a disabled person, 80 to 90% people are going to imagine a person with a physical impairment. We're not thinking about psychological, we're not thinking about what we call here in the US non apparent disabilities, what we call in India hidden disabilities. So, disabilities you can't see. We're not even thinking about that. We're thinking about people in a wheelchair. And when we think about that, that comes from this idea of disability equaling physical impairment or a physical condition or a medical condition. Like my dad's. My dad has ALS, which is a medical condition, essentially, right? And so, because disability conversation started from that space, right, the first view or the first record of disability we have is a physical impairment. It's a mobility impairment a lot of times. And so, that's when the medical component of the experience came to be highlighted. And then that just kind of stuck. Because also, the second piece is we as a society, we love things that are quantifiable, observable, measurable, right? We don't like things that we cannot observe. And so, if we have something to fix, if we have an impairment that we can treat, it's easier for us. We can make more sense of it, right? And so that's a big reason that we've over medicalized this community is okay, so if we have a treatment plan, a medical treatment plan, we can fix it, it's easy versus really going
Okay.
into the depth of the experience, talking to people, understanding lived experience, understanding day to day struggles that go way beyond the medical component. And I have to say, Sakshi, the medical component is important, right? We are not undervaluing that at all. For
Yeah.
people like my father, for people with fibromyalgia, for people with cerebral palsy, medical intervention is critical, is crucial. So medical providers have such an important seat at that table, but all we're saying is they can't take every seat at the table. We need therapists in there, we need social workers in there, we need lawyers in there, we need advocates in there, we need allies in there. So over medicalization, yes, but also medical intervention is important. I'm not saying it's not, I'm just saying we need to make more space for other people as well.
Because
Yeah.
if we see that um, any community that needs certain push, it has to come from everybody. We cannot be solely dependent on just doctors for it. We need community, as you mentioned. And if people are aware, if I imagine a disabled person, as you said, we do tend to think about movementary disability, and
Yeah.
there is so much more to that. And it keeps me wondering, why is it? Does history has a play in it? Does the videos we see, the movies we see, does that has a play in it? So what are your thoughts about it? How can you provide some brief history on how disability has been conceptualized and narrated in the world?
Absolutely. I'd love to because, again, we don't talk about that often enough. When we look at histories of the world, right, disability history is so hidden. When I think about history, Sakshi, the first thing I think about is variation in human bodies has existed since the start of time. But in our heads, we have this concept of what an able person is, what an able person looks like, right? And so, despite having that variation since the beginning of time, we people look different, people have different abilities, right? You might have a skill I might not have, I might have a skill you might not have. But if you look at history, there's again this one kind of stencil cut image of what a good citizen is. And that notion has been very prevalent throughout the history of disability rights. And so globally, India too, like globally, right? If you look at the global history of disability, it really started with just a lot of ridicule, stigmatization, of course, but a lot of even torture, right? If you look at the history in the US, even in India, there's been a lot of torture involved with this community. And so those experiences of torture, ridicule, stigma, all of that has been internalized to generations even today because of concepts like intergenerational trauma. And so, if you look at a country like the US and even in India, there's always been a few disabled people that come out from the community and say, hey, what about us? We need to be talking about our rights as well. And historically, and even today, that's been completely overlooked. In India is very interesting. And I'll talk about India because maybe a lot of our listeners are in India. In India, disability history is very interesting because when we think about disability in India, a lot of the understanding is about morality. Things like karma.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this person did something bad in their last life, or maybe this family's cursed. And that's how the history of disability has been in our country. If something is wrong with this family, maybe they've sinned. Maybe they did something in their last life that has led to this punishment of sorts. And
Mm-hmm.
can you see the very inherent pain that comes with that kind of a belief, right? We're saying this is something horrible and you must have done something horrible to cause this. And so when you look at history, that belief has been so internalized for people and for the community. And then now we're moving slowly away from that, which is wonderful to see in India, over the world. We're moving away from that morality place and we're moving more towards a social justice minority lens. But before all of that, there was, of course, the medical way of thinking about disability, right? So disability history has moved through so much activism. Um, Walks, protests, so much. In India, the National Federation of the Blind is actually very, very significant in our history in disability, which people don't know, but they've played a huge role in pushing disability rights forward. So, overall, the summary is it's a work in progress. Fortunately, conceptualization has changed from moral model to medical model to now social minority human rights model. So that transition is wonderful to see, but we have so much work to do. We have so much work to do. And I'm excited for it. I'm hearing conversations about disability more frequently, even today, than 4 years ago, which is insane, to see how fast we're moving. But I'm truly, truly excited about where we are headed.
Right, so I
Mhm.
really want to know, how does it affected the treatment of disability in India or in the world throughout history? Because I do hear about, like, a lot of the trauma is attached to it. so
Right.
so I
Right.
really want to know, how has treatment been changed from the history till now as we see today?
When we say treatment, there's it's such a broad term, right? Because there's treatment from a legal perspective. What are the
Yeah.
laws and policies in place to treat people with disability fairly? So I'm going to talk more from a societal lens because that question is so broad. The concept of treatment is so broad. So I'll talk about it from a societal lens. How have we been thinking about disabled people? So it started off, like we said, with morality. And the problem with morality, especially in India, when we say that you've done something bad and therefore you deserve this, we're saying that what you have is inherently a punishment. Which, can you believe how traumatizing it is to carry that with you on a daily basis, right? So the shame that comes with that, feeling of otherness that comes with that, of, oh, something is wrong with me, right? I'm the one to blame. So all of that internalized shame, you won't even believe it, I still work with clients that are struggling with that, what feels like intergenerational trauma. They grew up in a great environment, there was a lot of like equity and resources and all of that, but that generational and community trauma sticks with us, and
Yeah.
so you see treatment in that sense really leading the morality conceptualization leading to shame, the medical conceptualization leading to overlooking mental health, psychological well-being, right? And then now today with human rights, fortunately we're looking at like different systems that play a role in the disabled person's experience. So
Right.
history is important because history has resulted in current functioning in the way that people think about their identity today. I hope that answers your
Right.
question. I
Definitely.
get excited about this topic, as you can tell. But
Um, it really answers a lot of things that I had questions on, a lot of things that our listeners would have questions on, the history of disability and the community itself. So you mentioned, in our discussion earlier, that we have to acknowledge the variations in the human bodies, right? And that kind of shifts our perspective of disability. So, how can we as a community acknowledge that?
I remember the first time I was learning about models of disability, and I learned about the medical model and the social model and the model model, which we've touched on today. There's this one model called the limits model. Okay. And the limits model of disability is one that people don't talk about as much, but I found very interesting. The limits model essentially says that it's a matter of time. All of our ability is limited, right? So if they have this idea of I am temporarily able bodied. Tomorrow, something, I could be crossing the street, something can hit me, and I'm going to be a disabled person. I had a student last semester who fractured her leg and she couldn't come to class. She was disabled for a month, right? And so when we think of the limits model, it in my head puts us all at this even playing ground. And then it begs the question of, wait, what is the difference then between somebody like me, completely able bodied, and somebody like my dad who has a disability? Because I'm going to get there, or I could get there at any point. And so when we make it an even playing ground, we're able to think more inclusively. We're saying we're all the same, you know, and we're all the same. We have different struggles, and it can be only a matter of time before we get there. And so instead of thinking about these people as less than, thinking about disabled people as, not good enough, all of these like othering them, if we were to say this is all one huge group, with all of us in different time points, that just in my head makes it more easy to digest and makes it more easy to include.
That's such a phenomenal concept to talk about.
Right.
And I'm shocked how we never knew about it. We see so many concepts when it comes to talking about minority people, how
Right.
each one of us fall somewhere or the other another in that bracket of minority, but we do not
Right.
talk about concepts like these, that uh, it's just a matter of time that we can, or fortunately unfortunately, we can go into that bracket as well, and we have to be
Right.
inclusive to that thought.
Absolutely. And when you were speaking, I was also thinking, to also answer that kind of question about what can we do. We live in such a capitalist society. We live in such a capitalist society. And I'm in Silicon Valley, which I don't know if you know about this culture, but it's so productivity focused. Every single day, if you ask somebody, how was your
Uh-huh.
day? The answer is good or bad. Good, yes, I got a lot of work done. Bad, I got nothing done. Everything is about productivity,
Mm.
right? And so if you are a productive person, you're a good person, or if you're a productive person, you're a successful person, which is so problematic in disability communities. If we are
Yeah.
continuing that
Right.
narrative, right, producing more is better, keep producing, keep getting promoted, da, 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 all of that stuff that we're surrounded by all the time, we're completely undermining this community, because a person's value in society should never, never be associated with how much they're producing to a society. And what does production mean, right? Production doesn't always have to have an economic meaning tied to it.
Yeah.
We have disabled artists that are phenomenal. And so that's another answer to your question, right? To kind of challenge the way we think about success and productivity and the workforce and all of these concepts, to be more inclusive. So not
Mm,
everybody has to do a 9 to 5 job where they have to be promoted all the time. It's okay to just be more inclusive in the way we think about what a good work environment is and what a good career is and what productivity means. So I can't talk about disability without talking about that inherent flaw in our society
mm.
globally.
You know, it reminds me of this one quote that I read somewhere, that be happy knowing that your only purpose in life is to simply be.
Oh my God. If only I could get that tattooed all over me. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yes.
it makes so much sense that it doesn't always have to be what did I achieve in a day. It just has to be that, being grateful that I'm simply am, and we can show love to our loved ones and feel
Right.
love from our loved ones and see beautiful things around us. I think that's what
Absolutely.
we need to hear about. And a lot of motivational speakers who are disabled, they talk about these things, and everybody feels so inspired by it, that,
Mm.
yeah, definitely, that it doesn't always have to be what kind of work we do. It just have to be how grateful we are
Right.
in the present
Right.
situation, or everything that we have right now.
Absolutely. I love that you said that because I'm like a walking, moving billboard of that belief, right? Because in here in the US, in the Native American communities, that's such a big part of the way of life. These community members talk about the purpose of life is very akin to the purpose of life of these trees and the flowers
Yeah,
around us and the mountains around us, where the
yeah,
purpose is just to be. We don't have to be chasing so much. And I, as a therapist, disabled people, able-bodied people, I see the other side of this chasing, right, which is depression and anxiety and suicide, right? And so yes, that's a huge part of this conversation. We're not being inclusive, right? Big companies, we're not forget about recruiting disabled people because we're
mm,
thinking about productivity. And I understand that this is a larger economic conversation. They're businesses at the end of the day. So there's a lot of layers that we need to work through, but we need to start somewhere. And in my eyes, actually, that somewhere is things like this, that we
yeah,
just talk and work on destigmatization and building awareness about history. And there's a huge community in India, by the way, that does incredible work. The disabled community in India has been working so hard. There's incredible people. There's a foundation called the Tinkesh Ability Foundation that I'm also
mm.
working with, and I'm so excited about. And these are examples of foundations that are just like rooted in feelings of inclusion and equity and have been working hard for this community.
It's such a drastic difference that we see, talking about community who are doing so much for minority people, for differently able people. And on the other hand, we see these big companies who say that they do a lot about the community,
Mhm.
but I think all they do is, whenever that minorities month, they put up the posters, they roll out jobs for them,
Yeah,
that yeah, we are being inclusive, we are letting you work for us. That's a bare minimum thing that somebody has to
yeah,
do for being inclusive. Yeah,
right,
it's such a stark
right.
difference.
It's so sad.
Yeah,
And, I think another reason, I think you asked this question about the why, right? Why are we not doing more for disabled people? Another big reason for the why, I think, is people don't know how to help, right?
yeah,
There's this idea of, I don't know, it just is, again, that otherness, right? I don't know how to help these people. And I think a big part is exactly what you said, which is if you're saying that you are being inclusive as an organization, whether that's an NGO, whether that's a big tech company, if you're saying, you don't have to say it, but if you're saying you are accessible infrastructurally and attitudinally, and you want to be inclusive, ask questions.
yeah,
That's all. Express curiosity, right? Reach out to disabled people in your organization and say, what can we do? You don't have to be an expert. I mean, I train therapists to work with disability, and I tell my therapist that. You don't have to know because you're never going to know, especially if you're an able-bodied therapist or if you're an able-bodied employer. You're never going to know exactly how to do it perfectly, and this isn't about perfection.
yeah.
This is about curiosity. right? And respect, and saying what can we do and how can we learn, right? So that's a good first step, I think.
A lot of times we see that um, we really want to start that conversation and
Hmm.
show that curiosity whenever we see our colleagues or our batchmates with some or the other kind of disability. But it has never been taught to us how to be normal, right? You go there and you just don't know how to talk to or how to start that conversation. It just gets
Hmm.
so awkward for people.
Hmm.
It's just about showing curiosity, starting that one question, that how can we be more inclusive. So can you give more tips to people? How can they show more inclusivity? How can they show that not just being awkward and don't know how to start a conversation?
Absolutely. And I think I'm very happy to answer that question, because this is this is an answer that can be, in my opinion, applied to other difficult conversations, right? Whatever difficult conversation it is, whether it's a disability, race, a breakup, like any difficult conversation. We need to get comfortable with discomfort. We as a society need to get comfortable with discomfort. It's okay to be awkward. It's okay to not know what to say. It's okay to get things wrong when you're talking to a disabled friend. It's okay. Don't hurt them, right? Don't hurt them, but it's okay to not get things perfectly. So a lot of times I'll tell my therapist that I'm training, I'll say it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to be vulnerable yourself and say, I've never had a disabled client before, but I've done my research. I know about this community, but I don't want to generalize. So, can you tell me what you need? How can I support you? How can I support you? What has your experience been like being a disabled person in India? What has your experience been like being a wheelchair user in this company? How has it been? Let me listen, right? So, again, talking about history, Sakshi, for a second, disabled people have been put on this hierarchy where they are at the bottom. So it's a power dynamic, right? So we've been doing research on them versus with them.
Yeah.
We've been talking down to them, all of that. So now it's time to bridge that gap, right? So instead of us telling them what to do, we ask questions because they are the experts here, right?
Mm.
So if you have a disabled friend, just check in like you would with anybody else. Just check in and say, "Are you doing okay? I noticed that our employer doesn't have a ramp. How, like, what? That's so frustrating to me. Are you frustrated? What can we do, right? How can I help?" So taking more of that passive role and working towards empowerment, because disabled people have the power within, right? This is not about them, it's about the systems that have disempowered them. So ask those questions, express curiosity, express kindness, express respect is, I think, the first steps that way.
It's gonna help a lot of people out there, trust me.
I hope so.
uh, Dr. Shankar, you also mentioned that a lot of times we tend to the concept of othering, right? That differences
Hmm.
lead to othering of disabled individuals. So, since you have talked to a lot of people and trained therapists in that uh, concept, so what do you think? How does it impact um, on their mental health? Since we as a
Hmm.
society do not much talk about mental health of this minority section. So, can you throw some light on that for us?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So the reason, I'll start with the reason why we other, right? We other people because we have always, again, as a society, as a species, right? We've always feared difference. Anything that's different from us, there's this immediate physiological fear that comes up, right? And that's because difference also equates to unpredictability sometimes. We don't know, because we don't understand it, we don't know how they'll respond, right? And that's at the
Yeah.
root of this experience of othering. We other people because they're different, and because we don't understand them, and because we don't understand them, we don't know what they're capable of, is the notion, right? This is why we other people. But can you imagine being on the receiving end of that? On the receiving end, what they're receiving, right, is there's something wrong with me, I'm excluded, I'm not worthy of inclusion, I'm separate from the group, right? If I'm other, that means there's something wrong with me. I'm not included. And we know from just so much literature over like decades and centuries, we just know from so much documentation that a feeling of inclusion is very critical to safety and belonging. We need to feel included to feel belonged, right? Those are synonyms. And so we need to feel belonged to a group. We need to not feel excluded, because when we feel excluded, we don't have a sense of strong community, right? And we're all social beings at the end of the day. Globally, we're social beings. And so if we don't have that community support, if we are the only one outside of that group, can you imagine the trauma? Again, like we said, that's passed through the generations, right? And so othering has so many negative psychological impacts, physical impacts, legal impacts, economic impacts, right? So the more we other, the more we're pushing, like we said, in India, 80 million disabled people. 80 million, which is not even the full number, right? Anytime there's a statistic out there, I don't trust it, because there's a lot of people that don't report, and the non apparent disability and all of that. So there's 80 million people that we're just saying, you don't belong. And so that feeling of exclusion, consistent exclusion on a day to day basis, feeling like spaces are not accessible, is a momentary, day by day struggle that impacts mental health in so many different ways. Depression, we see so much self harm in this community. And if you are a multiple minority, so let's say you're a queer disabled person, forget about it. You're navigating so many isms on a moment to moment basis. So,
Right.
yes, othering has very, very, very significant psychological impacts on the psyche. Throughout history, it has, I believe.
And there's just so many
Yeah,
levels of marginalization,
yeah,
and it's so difficult for somebody to overpass it, and it's already getting very toxic to live in the current generation that we talk about. People comment on anything about you, and especially for differently able people, now they get a reason to do that. And it's so sad, it's so sad to think about that they have to deal with all of these things and people are unaware of it.
right, right.
Thank you so much for joining with this podcast, everyone. However, we will be back with another episode with Dr. Mansi, honoring July for its Minority Mental Health Month. So stay tuned for episode 2.